Greenland, the world's largest island. It is an often bleak, unforgiving land, with its ice sheets, fjords, harsh climate, rocky terrain, and remoteness. The northeastern part of Greenland is now an uninhabited national park, and the island's entire population, comprising mainly of Inuits and Danes, is a meagre 55,877 approximately. Astonishingly low considering its overall land mass. It has been inhabited intermittently for the last 4,500 years by the native Arctic peoples whose ancestors migrated there from what is now known as Canada, its closest neighbour along with Iceland in the east. In the 10th century, Greenland was discovered and subsequently colonised by Norsemen, led by the infamous Viking, Eric the Red. Despite the inevitable hardships of this far-flung outpost, the Scandinavian settlers thrived for nearly 5 centuries. They even gave the island its name in order to make it sound more appealing to would-be colonists. The communities of Greenland flourished until the 15th century, when tragedy seemingly struck. But before we find out what happened, it is necessary to take a leap forwards in time to the year 1721. During this year, a Norwegian missionary called Hans Egede sailed to Greenland from his homeland in search of its Norse community who hadn't been heard from in 200 years. His goal? To convert them to Protestantism. When he arrived, after a few days of exploring the coastal landscape and navigating the iceberg-dotted fjords, a little further inland, he couldn't find any Norsemen whatsoever. Upon meeting some Inuit hunters, he asked them where the European inhabitants of Greenland were. In response, they showed him the crumbling ruins of an ancient church, the only remnant of 500 years of occupation. Egede later wrote the following: "What has been the fate of so many human beings, so long cut off from all intercourse with the civilized world? Were they destroyed by an invasion of the natives, or perished by the inclemency of the climate and the sterility of the soil?" Actually, Hans Egede's theories weren't actually that far off the mark. However, I shall present each one of the respective theories, all of which are very highly plausible explanations, or at the very least they should be considered as contributing factors. 1. A war with the natives. The Vikings and Inuits, despite living virtually side by side, were not friendly with each other. The Norsemen referred to the Inuits as Skraelings, an Old Norse term which is roughly translated as wretches. Aside from this derogatory name-calling, the Inuit tribes probably resented the Vikings' invasion of their homeland. The Inuits probably would have had a significant advantage too. They would have known the terrain like the back of their hands and most likely boasted higher numbers. Number 2. Climate change. Modern-day scientists have been able to determine, by drilling holes into and taking samples from the various layers of Greenland's glaciers for laboratory analyzation, that the climate in the area was changing gradually during the time of the Viking settlements being inhabited. Sea ice also decreased during this period, making sailing between Greenland and Scandinavia less hazardous. At the time of the Norsemen's arrival, Greenland would have benefited from fairly clement weather, and its warm seasons would have lasted considerably longer. This meant that the livestock could graze happily, and more crops could be grown and harvested before the winter months descended. As centuries passed, the climate became colder, the soil of the island was affected by erosion, which dramatically reduced the overall crop yield and reduced the quality of grazing. Number 3. A cataclysmic event. In 1257 AD, a volcano on the Indonesian island of Lombok, half a world away, erupted. Ranked by geologists as the most powerful eruption of the last 7,000 years, Lombok had far-reaching consequences. Ice cores drilled from Greenland's vast ice sheet, which covers a colossal 80% of the country, show that sulfur ejected from the volcano into the stratosphere reflected solar energy back into space, cooling the Earth's climate. Number 4. Starvation. Due to the Viking settlements being situated in specific areas, carefully chosen for their proximity to the fjords, coast, and most fertile soil, the land most likely suffered soil erosion thanks to unavoidable overgrazing. Eventually, the crops would fail and livestock would begin to die before the human inhabitants of Greenland finally succumbed to long, slow, agonizing deaths. Number 5. Isolation. Greenland has very few trees. Perhaps this prevented the Vikings from building and repairing ships and leaving to start afresh somewhere else. Number 6. Disease. During the Vikings' time in Greenland, they only founded 2 main settlements, the first known historically as Gardar, among the fjords of the southwest coast, the second 240 miles north and known as the Western Settlement. Living in such tiny, close-knit communities may have increased the likelihood of disease. An epidemic could spread rapidly in such places and easily wipe out many, perhaps even all, of Greenland's approximately 2,500 Scandinavians. Number 7. Ignorance. As I mentioned earlier, the Vikings ridiculed the native Inuits incessantly, considering them to be very much beneath themselves in terms of intelligence and status. Sadly, in hindsight, they could have learned a thing or two from the Inuits. During the winter months, the natives survived on a diet of mostly marine animals, which kept them warm and their bellies full until the weather improved. The Vikings, however, relied mostly on their crops and livestock. Also, despite being competent fishermen and occasionally going on walrus hunting expeditions along the north coast, their techniques and knowledge of the best hunting spots were nowhere near as efficient as those of the Inuits. In terms of physical evidence, aside from the drilling of the ice sheet, of course, we have the following. Number 1. Archaeologists discovered that the Vikings relied heavily upon imported goods, such as grains and iron. Being unable to travel as frequently due to climate change and lack of timber, coupled with the Black Death epidemic decimating half of the population of Norway, Greenland's lifeline to the rest of the known world, may have prevented the importation of goods from continuing. It is also prudent to mention at this point that there is no evidence that the Black Death ever reached Greenland, although some other type of disease certainly could have led to their demise. Number 2. There exist written records detailing how sea voyages throughout the centuries could virtually wipe out local male populations in isolated island communities. In 1881, 80% of males from the Shetland Isles, off the coast of Scotland, perished in a single night during a bad storm, their tiny fishing vessels unable to protect themselves from the cruel mistress that is the sea. Towards the latter end of the Vikings' occupation of Greenland, storms would have been more frequent and devastating than before, so perhaps this led to their population dying out. Number 3. Icelandic records show that one Norse couple did manage to make it out of Greenland alive. Sigrid Björnsdottir and Torsten Olafsson were married at Falsey Church, Greenland, and in 1424 they needed to prove the location of their nuptials. Letters and witness statements apparently satisfied the Icelandic authorities, although sadly the remaining records do not specify whether they were among a few lucky survivors of whatever catastrophe befell Greenland or part of a larger organised migration. Number 4. Excavations at the sites of some ancient Norse homesteads in Greenland hinted towards an organised departure. Hardly any items of value were found, pointing towards the possibility that the residents decided to leave, taking most of their prized possessions with them. However, no records pertaining to this theoretical mass migration exist. It is equally plausible that they sold everything of value in order to avoid or delay starvation, or that later visitors looted the sites. Number 5. More excavations in Greenland during the late 1980s and early 1990s yielded an alarming discovery which may be our biggest clue yet. Analysing fossilised insects led scientists to believe that the Greenland Vikings did indeed perish, most likely from a combination of the theories above. The timeline would have occurred somewhat like this. Climate change. Starvation. Remains of dog bones found inside the site of a Norse home showing knife marks indicating that they were killed and eaten. The Vikings would only have resorted to eating their hounds if they were truly desperate. Death. After all the livestock and supplies were consumed, humans would have eventually starved to death. Insects usually found exclusively in food larders or around decaying corpses were found in the bedrooms of a Norse dwelling in high numbers, indicating that its residents died there and lay undiscovered for quite some time. Archaeologists are still excavating Norse sites in Greenland, so new evidence may yet come to light. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed hearing about this mystery which has intrigued Europeans, as well as experts and enthusiasts, for centuries.